What happens when one of the most unfiltered, fearless, and flat-out funny women in Hollywood walks onto the most opinionated talk show set in America and refuses to shrink? What happens when a woman who has spent her entire career telling other women to stop apologizing, to stop making themselves smaller, to stop asking for permission to exist loudly, sits down across from a host who thinks she knows better? What happens when a conversation about real estate, comedy tours, and self-empowerment somehow cracks open into something far more raw, far more personal, and far more revealing than anyone in that studio expected? Chelsea Handler walked onto The View on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. She came to talk about her life, a house she accidentally bought from one of the most controversial political families in America, a comedy tour that was selling out arenas across the country, and a message she had been delivering to women everywhere. Stop apologizing for taking up space. Simple enough, right? Except nothing is ever simple when Chelsea Handler is in the room, and nothing is ever simple on The View. By the time that morning was over, the studio would fall into a silence so complete you could hear the lights humming. Joy Behar would be sitting perfectly still, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and fury. The other hosts would be exchanging glances that said everything words couldn't, and Chelsea Handler would be walking off that set with the kind of calm that only comes from a woman who has absolutely nothing left to prove. And trust me, you'll want to hear how this one went down. The morning of the taping, the View set looked exactly the way it always does, bright, loud, warm in that particular way that television sets manufacture warmth, the kind that feels genuine until you look too closely. The studio audience was packed, mostly women. A lot of them had been fans of Chelsea Handler for years. They knew her from her late-night show, from her Netflix specials, from her books that sat on nightstands across America with dog-eared pages and highlighted passages. They were ready to laugh. They were ready to love her. The hosts took their seats with the easy confidence of people who had done this 10,000 times. Whoopi Goldberg settled in at the center of the table the way she always does, like gravity itself had assigned her that seat. Sarah Haynes arranged her notes with the quiet efficiency of someone who actually does her homework. Sunny Hostin smoothed her jacket and smiled at the camera. Alyssa Farah Griffin leaned over to say something to the producer just off stage, and Joy Behar sat at the far end of the table with that particular expression she wears when she's feeling sharp, feeling ready, feeling like today is going to be a good day to have opinions. Then the music hit, and Chelsea Handler walked out. The audience erupted, not polite applause, real, genuine, full-bodied noise. Women on their feet, whistles from the back rows. Chelsea walked across the stage with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who has been performing since she was barely old enough to drink legally, and she wore it the way she wears everything, like it fits perfectly and she didn't try at all. She was dressed simply, hair down, the kind of effortless that takes considerable effort. She hugged Whoopi first, a real hug, not a television hug. She waved to the audience with both hands like she was greeting old friends. She laughed at something Sarah said before she even sat down, and when she finally settled into her chair and crossed her legs and looked out at the room, she looked completely, entirely at ease. Whoopi leaned into the microphone. "Chelsea Handler, everybody. Welcome back." More applause. Chelsea grinned, that grin that her fans know well, the one that sits right on the edge between warmth and mischief, the one that says, "I'm delighted to be here, and I absolutely cannot be trusted." "It's good to be back," she said. "I feel like I've been everywhere lately, but this," she gestured around the studio, "this always feels like coming home. Chaotic, loud, everyone has an opinion." She paused. "So exactly like my actual home." Laughter. The audience was already hers. Whoopi smiled and shook her head. "Well, speaking of your home, we have to talk about this house situation, because when I heard this story, I genuinely did not believe it at first." Chelsea's eyes lit up. "Oh, here we go." "Tell them," Sarah said, gesturing to the audience. "Tell them what happened." And Chelsea launched into it, the story of how she had ended up the owner of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s former house. She told it the way she tells all her stories, with perfect comic timing, with specific, vivid details, with the kind of self-deprecating honesty that makes you feel like you're sitting across from her at a kitchen table rather than watching her on television. She described the real estate process with exasperated affection, how she had been looking for a new place, how her realtor had shown her a property that seemed wonderful on paper, how the transaction had moved quickly the way real estate transactions sometimes do, and how she had only discovered the previous owner's identity after the paperwork was already signed. "I find out," she said, leaning forward with the gleam of someone who has told this story enough times to have perfected every beat, "I find out it was RFK Jr.'s house, and my first thought was, okay, fine, interesting. My second thought was, what is wrong with the plumbing in this place? Because nothing worked, nothing made sense, and there was a room in the back that I still haven't figured out the purpose of." The audience was in stitches. The hosts were laughing. Sarah Haynes was covering her mouth. Even Sunny Hostin, who carries a certain dignified restraint at that table, was shaking with laughter. "How extensive were the renovations?" Sarah asked. "Extensive," Chelsea said flatly, which somehow made it funnier. "I'm talking, you know when you buy a house and the inspector says, oh, a few things need attention. This was not that. This was the house needed therapy. The house needed its own therapist." More laughter, more warmth, more of that particular magic that Chelsea Handler generates when she's comfortable, when the room is with her, when everything is going exactly the way it was supposed to go. Sunny leaned in. "And how do you feel about it now? Do you love the house?" Chelsea tilted her head in the way that suggested the answer was complicated. "I love the house the way you love a project you should never have started, which is to say, I'm deeply committed and occasionally furious." The audience loved that. The hosts loved that. The energy in the room was light and easy and warm. Everything was going perfectly. And then Joy Behar asked her first question. It started like these things always start on The View, with a compliment that isn't entirely a compliment. Joy Behar had been quiet for a few minutes, letting the other hosts carry the conversation, watching Chelsea the way a chess player watches the board. She had that look, the one her colleagues know well, the one that means she has something she wants to say and she's been waiting for the right moment. She leaned forward and smiled. It was a pleasant smile, a television smile. "Chelsea," she said, "I love the house story. I love all of it. And I want to talk about the comedy tour in a second. But I have to ask you something, because you've been talking a lot lately, in interviews, on your podcast, in your specials, about this idea of women taking up space, of women not apologizing. And I think that's wonderful in theory. I really do." Chelsea nodded. She was still smiling. She hadn't caught it yet, or maybe she had, and she was simply waiting. "But," Joy continued, "I wonder sometimes if that message, the confident, take no prisoners, don't apologize version of it, I wonder if that message lands differently depending on who's saying it. You know what I mean?" There it was. A low murmur moved through the audience, not quite a reaction, more like an intake of breath, the kind of sound a crowd makes when they sense something shifting. Chelsea's smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes changed. It was subtle. If you weren't paying close attention, you would have missed it entirely. But the cameras were paying close attention. They always are. "What do you mean by that?" Chelsea asked. Her voice was calm, polite, the kind of polite that is doing real work. Joy opened her hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I mean, you're Chelsea Handler. You're white, you're wealthy, you're famous. You have a massive platform. When you tell women to stop apologizing and take up space, you're speaking from a position where the world, for the most part, has made space for you. And I think for some women, women who don't have that platform, women who face different obstacles, that message might not be as simple as it sounds." The murmur in the audience shifted. Some nods, some stillness. Some people who had been leaning back were now leaning forward. Chelsea tilted her head very slightly. "That's an interesting way to frame it," she said, and her tone was still even, still measured, still polite. "No," Joy said. "No," Chelsea said, "because I think the premise," she paused, chose her words, "I think the premise assumes that the message only belongs to people who've already succeeded, and I actually believe the opposite. I think the women who most need to hear stop apologizing for existing are the women who are still fighting to be heard." A beat of silence. Then applause, real applause, coming from somewhere in the middle of the audience, spreading outward. Joy nodded slowly, and her tone suggested she had several more points of her own, and she was in absolutely no hurry. The tension had entered the room now. It was quiet, it was polite, it was wearing a pleasant expression and sitting up very straight at the table, but it was there. What followed was one of the most quietly electric exchanges The View had seen in years. Not loud, not dramatic in the way of raised voices and pointed fingers. Dramatic in the way of two intelligent, opinionated women who each believed they were right, taking each other apart with the precision of surgeons. Joy set down her pen. She did it with a particular kind of deliberateness, the kind that signals I am no longer taking notes because I no longer need notes. "Can I push back on something?" she said. Chelsea spread her hands. "Please." "You've talked in interviews," Joy began, "about your own journey, about therapy, about getting sober, about doing the inner work, and I respect all of that enormously. But here's my question. When you're standing in front of arenas full of women telling them to be bold and unapologetic and fearless, are you accounting for the fact that for some women, apologizing isn't a bad habit, it's a survival strategy? It's how they get through the day without losing their jobs, without making their home situation worse, without being seen as the angry woman, the difficult woman, the woman who is too much." The audience went still. Not silent, still. The difference matters. Chelsea uncrossed her legs. She sat forward slightly. When she spoke, her voice had dropped just a fraction, not in volume, but in temperature. "Joy," she said, "I hear what you're saying, and I want to be careful here because I think you're raising something real. I know women who live in exactly the circumstances you're describing. I'm not standing in front of audiences pretending those circumstances don't exist." She paused. "But there is a difference between acknowledging that the world is unfair to women, which it is, unambiguously it is, and telling women that the solution to that unfairness is to make themselves smaller. I'm not telling women to ignore risk. I'm telling them that they deserve to believe they're worth fighting for. Those are two different things." Sunny Hostin leaned in gently, the way she does when she's trying to add a layer rather than interrupt. "I think what Joy is getting at," she said carefully, "is the question of intersectionality. The message of take up space can carry different weight depending on race, depending on class, depending on a whole set of factors." Chelsea turned to Sunny with genuine attention. "And that's fair," she said. "That is genuinely fair. And I'll be honest, that's something I've had to learn. I don't claim to have a monopoly on this message, or to deliver it perfectly, or to fully understand every woman's experience. But the answer to 'this message doesn't reach everyone equally' is not to stop saying it. The answer is to keep saying it louder, and to keep widening the room of who gets to say it." The audience responded, warm, genuine applause, but Joy wasn't finished. Joy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She picked up her pen again, tapped it twice on her notepad, and set it back down. "I want to talk about the tour for a second, because I think it's connected. You've called it the High and Mighty Tour. And look, I love Chelsea Handler. I think you're hilarious. I think you bring real joy to people. But I've seen some of the content, and some of it is edgy, provocative. And I wonder if in these times when things are so serious, when people are scared and angry and overwhelmed, whether the 'just laugh at it' approach is helpful, or whether it lets people off the hook." A breath moved through the room. Chelsea's eyes narrowed, not in anger, not yet, but in the focused way of someone who has just heard something they want to take apart very carefully. "Joy," she said slowly, "do you believe that laughter is a coping mechanism?" Joy blinked. "Of course." "Do you believe that comedy has historically been one of the primary ways that marginalized people, that women, that people with no other power have processed and survived impossible circumstances?" "Yes, but—" "Then why," she said, her voice still even, still controlled, but carrying now with a weight that filled the studio, "why would you frame a woman standing in an arena making other women laugh as letting people off the hook? Comedy isn't the alternative to taking things seriously. For a lot of people, it's how they find the strength to take things seriously at all." The applause was louder this time. Alyssa Farah Griffin was nodding. Sarah Haynes was very still, watching. Joy held her ground.
I'm not dismissing comedy, I'm asking about the specific content. There's comedy that challenges power and comedy that just makes noise, and I think it's fair to ask which one you're doing. Something shifted in Chelsea Handler's face then. It was visible, a micro-expression, a fraction of a second, there and gone. The expression of someone who has just realized that this conversation has moved somewhere she didn't expect it to go. She took a slow breath, the kind of breath that is not about oxygen. "Joy," she said, and there was something new in her voice now, not anger, not defensiveness, but a kind of quiet directness that commanded the room. "Joy," she said, "I have never in my life waited for your permission to be taken seriously." The audience reacted, not quite applause, not quite a gasp, something between the two, a collective sound of recognition. Joy's chin came up. "That's not what I'm asking." "It's what it feels like," Chelsea said simply, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else she had said. Whoopi tried to step in. "Okay, I think," Whoopi began, but Joy pressed forward. "Chelsea, I think you're being a little sensitive." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Chelsea went very still. "Sensitive," she repeated, quietly, the way you repeat a word when you want everyone to hear it clearly. "I don't mean it as an insult," Joy said quickly. "I know you don't, but I want to sit with that word for a second. I want to sit with the fact that a woman telling another woman that she's being sensitive when that woman is simply defending her work and her message and her right to stand in front of other women and tell them they're worth fighting for." She paused. "I want to sit with how that lands." The studio was quiet in a way that studios rarely are. Sarah Haynes had stopped writing. Sunny was watching Chelsea with an expression that was difficult to read. Alyssa had her hands folded on the table. Whoopi was sitting back, letting it breathe, the way Whoopi always does when she knows something important is happening. And Joy was very still. Her expression was composed. Her eyes were bright. "I hear you," Joy said carefully, "but I think there's a difference between defending your work and refusing to engage with legitimate criticism." "The difference," Chelsea said, "is who gets to decide what's legitimate." A beat, long enough to be uncomfortable. Joy leaned forward. "The audience gets to decide. That's the whole point." "Then trust the audience," Chelsea said immediately. "They're filling arenas, they're buying tickets, they're standing up at the end of shows with tears on their faces because they spent 2 hours laughing and they needed it more than they knew. That's not noise, Joy. That's something real." Joy's voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in intensity. "I'm not questioning whether your audience loves you. I'm questioning whether what they love is what?" Chelsea asked, quietly. Joy stopped. "Is what?" Chelsea asked again, and now the room was hanging on the question like a held breath. Joy straightened. "Is the most useful thing you could be giving them." The silence that followed was the loudest silence the studio had heard all morning. Chelsea looked at Joy for a long moment, not with anger, not with hurt, with something that was harder to name and harder to look away from. "Joy," she said. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "The most useful thing I can give a woman who is exhausted and overwhelmed and scared and has been making herself small for 30 years so that the people around her will approve of her is 2 hours in a room full of other women, laughing, feeling like herself, remembering that she's allowed to be loud and funny and unapologetic and alive." The applause broke like a wave over the studio, long and genuine and coming from everywhere at once. And then Joy made a mistake. It was small, it was arguably well-intentioned, but in the charged atmosphere of that studio, with every person in that room leaning forward on the edge of what was happening, it was the wrong thing to say at the wrong moment to the wrong woman. Joy waited for the applause to quiet. She let the moment breathe, and then she said, with a smile that was trying too hard to be kind, "Chelsea, I just want you to be taken seriously." The studio went completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of a pause between thoughts, the total, ringing silence of a room that has just heard something that cannot be unsaid. Chelsea Handler looked at Joy for 5 full seconds without speaking. 5 seconds is an eternity on live television. The cameras caught it all. Joy's expression, which had started to harden into something defensive, Whoopi's face, which had gone very still, Sunny's eyes, which had closed briefly as if bracing for impact, and Sarah, who had one hand pressed flat on the table as if steadying herself. And Chelsea, Chelsea, who was sitting perfectly still, perfectly composed, with an expression that was not anger, not hurt, and not even contempt. It was something quieter and more devastating than any of those things. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. It was almost gentle. And she said, "Joy, I have never in my life waited for your permission to be taken seriously."
The words settled over the studio like snow. Soft, total, covering everything. Nobody moved. Joy's mouth opened slightly. Not to speak. There was nothing ready to come out. Just the automatic physical response to impact. Whoopi let out a breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. Sunny put her hand over her mouth, and Chelsea Handler reached up with one hand and unclipped her microphone from her collar. She did it with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this before, not in anger, not in haste, but with the calm deliberateness of someone who has simply decided that this particular conversation is over. She set the microphone on the table. She placed it gently, with a soft click that somehow, in the silence, sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she stood up. The audience stirred, confused, electrified, not entirely sure what they were watching. Some people started to clap reflexively, then stopped, then started again. Someone near the back let out a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a gasp. Chelsea smoothed her jacket. She looked around the studio, at the audience, at the cameras, at the other hosts, at the lights above the set that burned down the same way they always burn, indifferent to whatever is happening below them. And then she looked at Joy Behar one last time. Joy was sitting very straight. Her expression had settled into something that was trying to be composed and almost making it. Chelsea spoke quietly. She wasn't performing anymore. This was just her, in a room, saying something she meant. "I came here today to talk about buying a ridiculous house, making people laugh during hard times, and telling women that they're worth fighting for." She paused. "I didn't come here to earn your approval of how I do it." Another pause. "I never needed it, and I still don't." She picked up her bag from beside the chair. She looked at Whoopi and gave a small, genuine nod, the nod of one professional to another, the nod that said, "This isn't about you." She looked at Sarah and Sunny and Alyssa, and in that look was something that was almost warmth, the acknowledgement that whatever this had been, they hadn't been part of it. And then she walked off the set. Not fast, not slow, with the particular deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where they're going and isn't in any hurry to pretend otherwise. The studio erupted. Not in one clean emotion, in several at once, tangled together, overlapping, filling the space that Chelsea Handler had just left behind. Applause from one section, gasps from another, a few voices raised in the general direction of nobody in particular. Two women near the front on their feet, clapping above their heads, a ripple of confused conversation moving through the back rows. The host sat at the table in the particular stillness of people who are absolutely on camera and absolutely do not know what to do next. Joy was looking at the place where Chelsea had been sitting. Her expression was hard to read. It held too many things at once to resolve into a single feeling. Whoopi put both hands flat on the table and said, "Okay," in the voice she uses when she is buying herself exactly 3 seconds to figure out what comes next. Sunny was very still. Alyssa Farah Griffin pressed her lips together and looked down at her notes as if they might suddenly contain an answer. Sarah Haynes looked at the audience, and then at the empty chair, and then at the audience again. And the camera found Joy one more time, held on her face just a moment too long, the way cameras do when they know they're looking at something worth remembering, before cutting to commercial. When the cameras came back from that commercial break, the table had been quietly rearranged. The empty chair was gone. The hosts regrouped with the practiced professionalism of people who have spent years navigating live television, where the show continues regardless of what has just happened in it. But the moment didn't go anywhere. It was there in the room. It was there in the faces of the audience members who would carry it out of the studio and into conversations over dinner tables, and in text messages, and on text message timelines that were, even then, beginning to fill with clips and screenshots and the particular kind of digital noise that descends on a moment like this, the noise that means something real has happened. Because here is what that morning was actually about.
On the surface, it was about Chelsea Handler talking about a house and a comedy tour and a message about women. It was about Joy Behar asking pointed questions the way Joy Behar always does. It was about a conversation that started pleasant and got complicated and ended with a woman walking off a television set. But underneath that, underneath all of it, was something older and harder and more familiar than any specific argument either woman made. It was about who gets to decide what is serious, who gets to determine what is worthy, who holds the authority to grant a woman permission to be taken seriously on her own terms, in her own voice, doing her own work in the way she has chosen to do it. Chelsea Handler has never been the comedian the establishment decided she should be. She has never made the shows they thought she should make, said the things they thought she should say, or apologized for the ways in which she refused to fit the shape they had prepared for her. And the thing about a woman like that, the thing that makes her dangerous in certain rooms, is not that she's angry, it's that she's free. Joy Behar is a formidable woman. She is funny and sharp, and she has spent decades at that table saying things that needed to be said and asking questions that needed to be asked. Her criticism of Chelsea was not meaning-spirited. It was not malicious. It came from a genuine place, a woman with strong views about what matters and how it should be communicated. But in that moment, in that studio, in front of that audience, what happened between those two women was something that plays out every day in offices and conference rooms and dinner parties and family gatherings all over the world. It was the moment when one woman looks at another woman doing her work her way and says, "Let me tell you how to do it better." And the other woman says, "No." Not rudely, not dramatically, just no. Chelsea Handler sat in that chair and she absorbed the implication that her work wasn't serious enough, her message wasn't nuanced enough, her comedy wasn't useful enough, and her way of moving through the world wasn't worthy of being taken seriously without someone else's endorsement. And she looked at Joy Behar, a woman she knew, a woman in some ways she respected, a woman who was sitting in a television studio surrounded by cameras and lights and the accumulated weight of 30 years of professional authority, and she said, "I have never waited for your permission." That's not a TV moment. That's not a clickbait headline. That is a thing that is true. It has always been true. And the reason it hit the room the way it did, the reason it fell into that complete electric silence, is because every woman in that studio, in that audience, watching at home knew exactly what it meant. Because most of us are still waiting. Most of us are still sitting across from someone, a boss, a partner, a colleague, a panel of people with opinions about how we should do the thing we do, and waiting for the nod, the approval, the confirmation that yes, we have done it correctly, we have taken up exactly the right amount of space, we have been serious in precisely the right ways, and we may proceed. Chelsea Handler is not waiting. She hasn't been waiting for a long time. And on a Tuesday morning on The View, in a studio full of cameras and lights and people who came to watch a friendly interview about a house and a comedy tour, she reminded an entire room of that fact. It was bigger than real estate. It was bigger than comedy. It was bigger than Joy Behar and the particular questions she chose to ask. It was the moment a woman who had been told in 100 different ways by 100 different people in 100 different rooms that she was too much, too loud, too unserious, too unapologetic, too comfortable in her own skin, looked at the person across the table and said, "I see what you're doing. I understand what it means, and I'm going home now." That's not a TV moment. That's not a clickbait headline. That is a thing that is true. And in a world that spends enormous energy trying to make women forget that, that is something worth watching. So here's the question we're leaving you with tonight. And it's not a simple one. It's not meant to be. Was Chelsea Handler right to walk off that set? Was she right to refuse the frame that Joy Behar was putting around her work, the frame that said, your comedy needs to justify its existence, your message needs to be more carefully constructed, you need to be taken more seriously before you can ask other women to take themselves seriously? Or did Joy have a point? Is there something to the argument that people with large platforms have a particular responsibility to think carefully about the messages they send, and that stop apologizing is not a one-size-fits-all prescription for a world where different women face different consequences for the same behaviors? Was this a woman defending her dignity, or a woman refusing a fair conversation? Was this a clash of egos, or a clash of philosophies? Was Chelsea too sensitive, or was Joy not sensitive enough? We want to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments below and be honest, because the interesting answer is rarely the easy one. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about a room you've sat in, a conversation you've had, a moment when you either waited for permission you shouldn't have needed or gave it to someone who didn't ask for it, share it. Share what it brought up for you, because that conversation in the comments, that's the real show. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because we are just getting started. We have more of these stories about the moments that don't make the highlight reel, about the things that get said in front of cameras that the internet preserves forever, about what happens when the version of events the public is told doesn't quite match the version that actually happened. There are stories that will surprise you. There are moments that will make you angry. There are conversations that will make you feel less alone. We'll be here. Come back, because the most interesting things that happen on television are rarely the things that were planned.